Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're doing something a little different. We're going to track your tax dollars straight into one of the most complex and frankly staggering ecosystems on Earth, the political economy of war. We're going to connect the dots between how modern conflicts are actually waged, who exactly is profiting behind the scenes, and that monumental, often completely messy task of cleaning up the aftermath. Okay, let's dive right into this with a number that's honestly hard to wrap your head around. $2.4 trillion. Over just the last 5 years, private firms have received $2.4 trillion in Pentagon contracts. To put that into perspective, that represents over half of the Department of Defense's entirely discretionary spending over that same period. The sheer scale of this number tells us something absolutely crucial. You just cannot understand modern defense strategy without understanding the massive financial machinery that powers it.
So, to understand how all that money flows, here's our roadmap for today. We'll be looking at the political economy of war, privatizing the battlefield, the trillion-dollar war machine, Silicon Valley's entrance into defense, turning profit into power, and finally, the actual cost of rebuilding.
Let's kick things off with Section 1, the political economy of war.
When we look at conflict through an economic lens, we really have to stop seeing it as just a battlefield. We start seeing it as this vast, sprawling system of resource allocation. It forces us to ask the uncomfortable questions, like why do wars actually begin? Who's funding them? And crucially, who capitalizes on these new markets once the violence finally stops? By defining war through this economic framework, we start to see how the financial incentives and disincentives of all these different actors deeply influence the course of history.
Moving right along to Section 2, privatizing the battlefield.
Now, to really grasp how modern war is waged, we have to look back to September 2001. Former U.S. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld challenged the military to basically outsource everything but its absolute innermost core. His famous mandate to shift resources, quote, from tail to tooth, perfectly contextualizes the modern push to rely on private firms. The whole idea was to tap directly into the private sector's techno-managerial expertise for better cost-effectiveness and flexibility.
Historically speaking, sociologists like Max Weber argued that a true state has an exclusive monopoly on the legitimate use of physical force, right? But private military companies, or PMCs, they completely flipped that script. Today, corporate interests and private actors literally stand shoulder to shoulder with state militaries, providing services that used to be entirely the government's job. These transnational firms have essentially become powerful, independent governing nodes in global policy.
Which brings us to Section 3. The trillion-dollar war machine.
Let's look at how this privatization actually translates into hard taxpayer dollars. Just notice the staggering financial disparity here. Between 2020 and 2024, the government poured $771 billion into just 5 weapons companies. Now look at the other side. In that exact same time frame, global diplomacy and international aid received less than half of that amount. It's a pretty stark indicator of exactly where national security priorities are financially anchored, wouldn't you say?
And this massive wave of funding primarily flows straight to the Big Five. These are your legacy companies, folks, like Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and General Dynamics. Their entire business models are built on these massive multi-decade programs for traditional heavy hardware. We're talking warships, combat aircraft like the F-35, and advanced missile systems.
But things are changing, which leads us to Section 4, Silicon Valley enters defense.
We are actually right in the middle of witnessing a massive, fundamental tension in the defense industry right now. The old guard of heavy hardware is facing a serious challenge from the new blood, tech startups out of Silicon Valley. They're making the argument that tomorrow's wars aren't going to be won by heavy metal alone. They're going to be won by software. This new paradigm focuses intensely on artificial intelligence, drone swarms, and autonomous systems. These newer tech companies are essentially arguing that the existing legacy contractors just move way too slowly and honestly lack the software expertise required for future conflicts.
So let's take a look at who's actually leading this charge. You've got SpaceX, heavily involved in launching military satellites and providing vital Starlink communications. Then there's Palantir, securing absolutely massive contracts for AI-driven data platforms and advanced targeting systems like Project Maven. And then you have Anduril, building out autonomous underwater vehicles and counter-drone defenses. The Pentagon is actively pouring millions into this new, highly tech-driven vision of warfare.
Okay, let's move to Section 5, turning profit into power. Whether it's the old guard or the new tech firms, you really have to ask, how do these companies ensure their budgets literally never shrink? Well, they use a very specific, systemic playbook to capture political influence. Millions of dollars flow into congressional campaign donations, especially targeting members of the armed services committees. And this is backed up by an army of nearly 1,000 defense lobbyists. On top of that, they actively fund major think tanks to help shape military strategy, and they secure seats on government advisory commissions to recommend future spending. It's the whole shebang.
And what's wild is that we're even seeing a brand new spin on the classic revolving door in Washington. You know, traditionally, Pentagon officials might leave government to go work directly for a major defense contractor. Standard stuff. But today, they are increasingly moving over to venture capital and private equity firms that invest specifically in Silicon Valley defense startups. They take those deep, established Washington connections over to the VC world, hoping to really cash in on the next generation of weapons tech.
Finally, we reach the end of the conflict lifecycle in Section 6, the cost of rebuilding. This is where the dust settles and the cameras usually leave. While billions are spent with, frankly, terrifying efficiency on the machinery of war, the post-conflict reality is vastly different. Rebuilding economies and deploying foreign aid is slow, it's incredibly messy, and it presents a completely different kind of logistical nightmare compared to actually waging the war itself.
As analyzed by the Institute for State Effectiveness, international stakeholders face some truly sobering challenges here. First, you have to establish a citizen-centered roadmap for recovery. Then, you have to navigate what they call complex reform sequencing, which is essentially trying to figure out exactly what gets fixed first when literally everything is broken. And perhaps the most daunting hurdle is defeating that follow-the-money corruption cycle. You have to ensure that aid money actually rebuilds a nation, rather than just vanishing into illicit networks.
And this brings up a really fascinating concept called the absorptive capacity limit. It's a delicate balance. Think of a recovering nation kind of like a completely dry sponge. If you take a whole bucket of water and pour it on all at once, most of it just runs off and makes a huge mess. Flooding a fragile state with too much money, too quickly, without the proper institutions in place to manage it, can actually spark hyperinflation and destabilize the region even further. So there's this critical point where unmanaged aid literally becomes bad aid. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with one final thought to chew on. We've traced the trillions flowing to defense contractors, the lobbyists, the new tech startups. We know exactly who profits from the business of waging war. But when you really consider the fragile, messy, and chronically underfunded reality of post-war reconstruction, who truly pays for the peace? Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the data.